Very few characters in the early days of Elden Ring rose to the level of prominence seen by our favorite potboy, Iron Fist Alexander. While his story and that of Jar-Bairn have been tread many times by various lore channels, they offer surprisingly little in the way of what the purpose of the living jars may be, outside of the plainly explained goals of a warrior jar. One need only take a look around Jar-Bairn to see that not every living jar is cut out to be a warrior. Jar-Bairn himself seems to want to keep his potential to be a warrior jar under wraps, as he asks you not to tell anyone. So if every jar is not cut out to be a warrior, what other purpose could they serve? Today we are going to dissect what exactly the living jars are, and provide our theories on what their role may have been before the shattering, as well as where we think they stand now. While we'll try to stay away from the well-swum waters of Alexander and Jar-Bairn's stories, we will call out important notes we can learn from interacting with them. Before diving into the possible history of the living jars, we wanted to take a second and ask you to subscribe to the channel. We love crafting these Elden lore videos and interacting with the community so we can all come to a deeper understanding of the lands between. If you've enjoyed any of our previous lore videos, or just want to join the conversation, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our content. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments. In order to develop an understanding of the living jar's place in the lands between, we must first understand what these creatures are. During one of our many meetings with Alexander, he tells us,
I was created to be a warrior vessel. Many great warriors reside within me, ever dreaming of becoming a great champion. It's my destiny, and the reason for which I quest. It is my ordeal, you could say. To test myself, to better myself, to fell ever greater foes. And then, one day, we'll be a single great champion. The greatest of them all. What do you think, eh? How do you rate my chances?
The most important thing we learned from this conversation is that Alexander was created, not born. The living jars are not natural beings. They're constructs created by someone to fulfill a purpose. Should we kill Alexander early on, we receive the warrior jar shard, which tells us, scraps of stewed flesh cling to the shard, and tatters of ornaments can be seen mingled within the slime. Relics of ancient royal warriors, perhaps. There's nothing particularly new to learn from this description, but it does specify that the remains found within belong to an ancient royal warrior, whereas regular living jar shards make no such claim. The average living jar shard only says, such fragments command a high price due to the magical power locked within. This leaves the living jars unfortunate targets for poachers. To us, this lays out clearly that not all jars are focused on gathering the remains of warriors, so they must have had some other purpose, removed from that of the warrior jars. So we have two questions in front of us. Who created the living jars? And for those that weren't warriors, why were they created? Many jars can be found across the lands between that are benign until you invade their space. These areas include Stormvale Castle, Raya Lucaria Academy, Caria Manor, the Giant's Mountaintop Catacombs, and the Ariza Side Tomb. But what's more interesting is where you can find the remains of living jars. Strewn around various minor Erd trees we can see jars, smashed and broken, drained of their insides. While we know that poachers and perfumers hunt the jars thanks to the iron jar aromatic, which tells us it is an art that requires fragments of hunted noble jars, depraved perfumers are plainly in league with jar poachers. We think it's unlikely that this would simply be a dumping ground for their remains after the poachers got what they wanted. For one thing, it seems like what they find so valuable about the jars is their outsides, not their innards. So why are these shattered jars littering the tree's base? Perhaps there's a clue on the living jars themselves. If you look at the seal found at the top of every living jar, you'll see a depiction of the Erd tree. This, to us, implies that whoever made the jars likely did so in order for them to serve the Golden Order. Who exactly this was is up for debate, but given that we find jars in both Raya Lucaria and Lucaria Manor, we're inclined to think they were brought to life by the magics of the Carian royal family. The point is, how could these jars best serve the Golden Order? Perhaps by taking the common folk of the lands between to their final resting places. We know the jars are full of corpses, all strewn together, and we know that not everyone earned the privilege of Erdtree burial. If we assume that the jars, before the shattering, walked the land, scooped up the dead, and brought their remains to their final resting place by a minor Erdtree, this would not only explain why there are broken jars all around them, but would also present an alternate purpose for the Erdtree avatars. These jars are all smashed, and the avatars carry large weapons that seem perfect for destroying jars. This would effectively end the life of the jar, their purpose fulfilled, while at the same time feeding the Erdtree with less worthy souls. It seems as though this purpose was lost after the shattering. For whatever reason, jars are self-aware, which we doubt was the case in the early days of their creation. We believe there are only two types of jars, the ones which deliver corpses to the minor Erdtrees, and the warrior jars, meant to gather up the remains of great warriors, possibly those worthy of Erdtree burial. We believe they lost their original purpose due to how we meet them through the lands between. They're never found wandering the world. They seem to have their own niches carved out for themselves, areas of castles or tombs where they are left alone. Of course, they even have their own town, Jar-Bairn, which seems to be a place where they live peacefully, without a care in the world, outside of finding a new potentate and avoiding poachers. The companion jar talisman even tells us, though the jars are brought to life by human flesh and blood, they are all rather kindly folk. Perhaps they were made to be better than their innards. Whatever spark of self was set off within the jars, it leads them to want to live lives of peace and tranquility. With that said, there's another aggressive form of jar we can find as a summon when completing the Oriza side tomb. The soul jars of Fortune Ashes tell us. These reckless spirits sacrifice themselves to vanquish their summoner's foes and explode upon death. Though their bravery is admirable, their explosions can harm friend as well as foe, and they will also immediately explode on contact with fire. Tell the others. Tell them how brightly a fire jar burns. So these living jars are self-proclaimed fire jars, prepared to sacrifice themselves in battle to protect their summoner. We believe it's likely that these jars found purpose in defending their brethren from poachers and perfumers, who were after the jars for their innate magical being. They may not have been warriors, but their sacrifices would give the other living jars a fighting chance, or the time needed to run away from those ready to murder them for their shards. These jars, knowing they were no warriors, chose to preserve the peace of their brethren by sacrificing themselves, a noble act to say the least. While we're discussing the purpose of the jars, we feel it's important to mention the great jar that sits in front of the Colosseum in Caelid. It says not a word, but sets enemies to fight us and have our tarnished prove their worth. After completing its challenge, we're given the Great Jar's Arsenal Talisman, which tells us, the Great Jar grants this talisman to their warriors. Carry as much as you can, grow big and strong. We believe the existence of this Great Jar may actually lend credence to our idea of their creation being tied to a time long before the shattering. The matches held within the Colosseum likely took place during Godfrey's time as Elden Lord, which means we can trace the roots of these creatures back at least that far. Perhaps this jar was made to test those who wish to make their way into the Colosseum, and the reason it's grown so large is because it continues to take in those who fight and die behind its walls. Interestingly, it seems that at one time, warriors may have wanted to become one with the warrior jars. The puppet jar rite tells us the story of a man who wished to be one with the champions within a warrior jar. Spirit of a man who wished to become the innards of a living jar, a jar-hurling specialist who throws all manner of pots and jars. The warrior jar once told the nameless man this: "You are not yet ready to join the warriors inside. No, you must apply yourself, better yourself, and one day I will return for you." This warrior jar could have been Alexander. It certainly sounds like his tone of voice, and it's sad to know that Jarrite was turned into a puppet before he could fulfill his quest. Ultimately though, it's hard to parse out to what ends a warrior jar gathers strength post-shattering. Maybe once it was to provide Erdtree burials, but now it seems to be a matter of becoming the strongest warrior one can possibly be. Unfortunately for Alexander, even with the strength of Radahn's remains inside of him, he was no match for our Tarnished. We know he consumed at least some piece of Radahn through his shard, which says, "Scraps of stewed flesh cling to the shard, and tatters of ornaments can be seen mingling within the slime." Relics of a red-haired champion, it would seem. Still, both Alexander and Radahn can now live on through Jar-Bairn, after we give him Alexander's innards. Perhaps this is another form of the cycle of death and rebirth in the lands between, even if the Erdtree itself is left out of the equation. Thank you for joining us as we talk through our theories on the history and purpose of the living jars. Do you have any ideas of your own about why so many broken jars litter the base of the minor Erdtrees? Who do you think created the jars? Let us know in the comments. Like this video and subscribe to the channel if you learned anything new or just enjoy our form of storytelling. It'll also ensure you don't miss any in our series of Elden lore content. We look forward to seeing you again for more Elden lore.